inside Leavenworth, America's oldest federal prison, and still running like a war zone. If you control Leavenworth, you control the flow of fear in federal prison. Former inmate, as quoted in a 1998 Department of Justice report. Leavenworth stands in the heart of Kansas, massive, grim, and unyielding. From a distance, it looks like a medieval fortress, not a federal correctional facility. Thick limestone walls rise above the flat plains, crowned with guard towers that have watched over some of the most dangerous men in America. When the gates close behind you, you don't just enter a prison, you step into a world where time moves differently and violence has its own language. For more than a century, Leavenworth Penitentiary has been the centerpiece of federal incarceration. Opened in 1903, it was designed to be the pride of the U.S. Department of Justice, a model of order, industry, and moral reform. But within a decade, its reputation began to darken. Reports of inmate-on-inmate violence, black market trading, and guards turning a blind eye began to leak beyond those walls. Even today, the echoes of that past haven't faded. Leavenworth is no longer officially classified as a maximum security prison, yet, according to federal inspection reports and multiple news investigations, it remains one of the most violent and chaotic correctional institutions in the United States. In the early 20th century, the prison's construction was meant to symbolize America's growing belief in reformation through labor. Inmates quarried their own stone, built their own cells, and even helped raise the 40-foot perimeter walls that would later cage them in. Newspapers at the time described it as the most humane experiment in discipline ever attempted. But inside those same walls, brutality simmered. By 1915, internal reports documented dozens of beatings, forced labor punishments, and even deaths listed vaguely as accidental. According to Archived Bureau of Prisons records, several early wardens were quietly replaced after congressional inquiries found evidence of systemic abuse and corruption. Leavenworth had already become what prison historians later called a silent empire, a place where rules existed, but only for those who had power to enforce them. By the 1930s, that empire attracted the new American underworld. Gangsters, bank robbers, and organized crime figures began arriving in shackles. George Machine Gun Kelly, Al Capone's lieutenants, and dozens of Prohibition-era criminals served time here. Yet it wasn't just the inmates shaping Leavenworth's future. The staff, too, evolved. Many guards were war veterans hardened by combat. They enforced discipline with fists and nightsticks. Complaints from prisoners were often ignored, or worse, punished. A former corrections officer told the Kansas City Star in a 1997 interview, "It wasn't about reform. It was about control. If you didn't hit first, you lost the yard." The post-war years brought something new: political prisoners and gang leaders from across the country. Inmates from Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York brought with them the street politics of the outside world. Racial divisions deepened. The prison's hierarchy became militarized. By the late 1960s, the federal government acknowledged the crisis. Congressional hearings cited Leavenworth as one of several institutions that had failed to maintain lawful order. Inmates filed lawsuits alleging excessive force and inhumane conditions, echoing similar complaints from Attica and Angola. One such case, Johnson v. United States, 1973, documented extreme overcrowding, 2,400 inmates in a facility built for 1,500, and described continuous threats of violence, fear, and reprisal. The federal court ultimately found significant constitutional violations in Leavenworth's operations, forcing limited reforms. But reform, as history would show, didn't last long. In the 1980s and 1990s, Leavenworth became a nexus of cartel violence and gang expansion within the federal system. The Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla Family each fought for dominance. According to a 1995 Department of Justice review, an average of one violent incident occurred every 48 hours. Homemade knives, shanks, were found hidden in light fixtures, library books, and laundry carts. Guards discovered elaborate communication networks between inmates and organized crime figures on the outside. The violence wasn't random. It was strategic. Every killing, every stabbing sent a message, not to the warden, but to the opposing faction. An inmate once told a reporter for the Leavenworth Times, "This place teaches you one rule: survive the day or you don't see tomorrow." But perhaps the most shocking revelations came not from inmates, but from the guards themselves. In 2016, a sweeping FBI investigation exposed corruption and smuggling within Leavenworth staff. Federal prosecutors alleged that guards were trafficking contraband, from cell phones to narcotics, and turning a profit from the chaos. Court filings showed that some officers accepted bribes to allow certain inmates privileges, effectively letting gang leaders operate mini-empires behind bars. The scandal also uncovered something more chilling: the existence of illegal surveillance and hidden recording devices inside attorney-client meeting rooms. When defense lawyers discovered their conversations had been secretly recorded, the case exploded nationally. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Kansas eventually admitted that hundreds of privileged meetings had been compromised. Legal experts called it one of the biggest breaches of inmate rights in federal history. By the time the investigation concluded, Leavenworth's reputation was beyond repair. Reform programs were reintroduced, and several officials were removed. Yet the culture of distrust remained. As one former warden confessed to the Washington Post, "You can rebuild a wall, but you can't rebuild the spirit of a place that's been broken for 100 years." Leavenworth, once envisioned as a monument to justice, has instead become a warning, a testament to how even the most secure systems can decay from within. Today, its stone towers still cast long shadows over Kansas, symbols of endurance and failure alike. The wars may have changed, from gang rivalries to bureaucratic corruption, but the fortress still stands, waiting for its next storm. Empire of violence. In Leavenworth, violence wasn't random, it was organized. It had rules, ranks, and repercussions. Former inmate interview, Kansas City Star, 1998. Leavenworth didn't just house criminals, it manufactured power structures. Behind its 40-foot limestone walls, a new kind of empire was born. Not of kings or presidents, but of shot callers, men who could command hundreds with a single nod. By the 1980s, the prison had evolved into a complex network of race-based alliances and underground economies. The administration believed it was running a system of discipline. In truth, the inmates had built a government of their own. According to Federal Bureau of Prisons intelligence reports from that era, Leavenworth became a model of self-policing, where gangs enforced order faster and often more brutally than guards could. The three dominant forces were well known to investigators: the Aryan Brotherhood, AB, whose members swore loyalty in blood and hatred; the Black Guerrilla Family, BGF, ideologically charged and militant; the Mexican Mafia, LAIM, organized with military precision and ruthless discipline. Each ran their own economy, gambling, drugs, protection rackets, and had their own judicial system. When a debt wasn't paid, there were no second chances. A man could be greenlit before he even knew it. The yard as a battlefield. The prison yard, a cracked expanse of concrete and patchy grass, became a chessboard for territorial control. Inmates didn't just walk, they patrolled. Each gang claimed corners of the yard, specific tables in the mess hall, even sections of the chapel. Guards referred to the daily routine as a powder keg with a schedule. In a 1992 report, one correctional lieutenant described it this way: "You could feel it like static in the air. Everyone smiling, but everyone armed. Knives were everywhere. made from toothbrushes, metal trays, even sharpened bolts stripped from bunk. When violence erupted, it was swift and precise, often in under 30 seconds, before officers could even react. Leavenworth was supposed to be a place of correction. Instead, it was a place of selection, where only the most cunning and ruthless survived long enough to gain influence. The underground economy. According to court testimony from U.S.V. Miller, 1998, Leavenworth's black market was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Everything, cigarettes, drugs, phones, even food, had a price. Cigarettes were the original currency. One pack could buy a haircut, a favor, or a weapon. But as contraband phones and synthetic drugs like K2 entered the prison system, digital power became the new wealth. Guards who turned corrupt were known as mules. They'd smuggle in small packages, hidden in lunchboxes, boots, or sometimes mail. Inmates coordinated through coded letters, invisible ink, and relatives on the outside. By the mid-90s, Leavenworth was a hub of organized federal crime. Drug orders left the prison and reached across state. Money flowed back through Western Union, often in the names of innocent family members. Federal prosecutors later called it a criminal network with walls. The code of silence. Violence in Leavenworth wasn't just tolerated, it was ritualized. When someone broke a code, there was only one punishment. Inmate Marcos, a pseudonym from a 2003 Department of Justice report, described it bluntly. You don't snitch, you don't steal, and you don't lie to your people. Break one, and you get buried in laundry. There were no formal funerals, but everyone knew. Whispers spread through the tiers, through the metal bars, through the vent. By nightfall, a cell would be empty, and the next morning, cleaned as if nothing had happened. Even guards were part of the silence. Many refused to testify or write reports that might spark retaliation. The prison had its own form of diplomacy. Certain officers were trusted by gang representatives to maintain balance. A retired federal officer later told NBC News, "You couldn't police Leavenworth like a normal prison. You negotiated it, like a foreign government." The riots that defined the 1990s. On August 5, 1995, Leavenworth reached a boiling point. What began as a dispute over stolen commissary turned into a full-blown riot that lasted more than 6 hours. According to Associated Press reports, inmates overran sections of the main yard and cell blocks, setting fires and taking hostages. At least 7 officers and dozens of inmates were injured. When tactical teams finally regained control, the damage was staggering. Burned offices, destroyed records, and a trail of improvised weapons scattered across the compound. Federal investigators found that the riot wasn't spontaneous. It was a message, retaliation for the transfer of a high-ranking Mexican mafia leader. The gangs had united temporarily under one goal: to remind the Bureau of Prisons who really held the power inside Leavenworth. Psychological warfare. In the aftermath, the prison doubled down on control. Cameras were added, visitation rules tightened, and informants were planted. But that only fueled the paranoia. Leavenworth had become a psychological battlefield. Prisoners suspected their friends of being informants, officers suspected everyone of collusion. Even sleep became a privilege, the sound of cell doors slamming, men screaming in solitary, guards pacing the tiers with flashlights. Time itself was torture. One inmate later wrote in a letter to the Topeka Capital Journal, "You don't count days in Leavenworth. You count noises, the screams, the metal, the silence." The long-term effect was devastating. Rates of mental illness, suicide attempts, and self-harm climbed sharply through the 2000s. Psychologists from Kansas University Medical Center, who reviewed inmate records in 2010, found sustained patterns of trauma consistent with combat exposure. For many, Leavenworth wasn't a correctional institution, it was a war zone that never ended. The unseen power. While gang wars grabbed headlines, something quieter, and far more dangerous, began happening behind closed doors: the rise of inmate-led governance. Leavenworth's internal order was run by a small council of reps, one from each major group. They handled disputes, negotiated contraband trades, and even resolved violence before it reached staff attention. Wardens tolerated it because it reduced chaos. But in doing so, they handed control to the very men they were supposed to contain. According to Federal Bureau of Prisons archives, this informal system was still influencing internal operations well into the 2010s. It was efficient, terrifying, and unstoppable. Leavenworth's empire wasn't built on bricks and barbed wire. It was built on fear, profit, and silence. A society within a society, with its own economy, laws, and government, one that mirrored the outside world's corruption in microcosm. And as history would show, when power festers unchecked for too long, it doesn't stay hidden forever. The corruption files. When corruption hides inside a prison, it doesn't just stay there, it spreads like rot through the justice system itself. Former DOJ investigator, 2017 congressional hearing. Leavenworth had always been a story of violence. But in the early 2000s, the real war moved into offices, file rooms, and secret recordings. What was once a fortress of discipline became the center of a scandal that nearly tore through the very foundation of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and exposed just how blurred the line between warden and warlord could become. The whispers begin. It started with whispers. Inmates claimed that some officers were living far beyond their paychecks: new trucks, lavish vacations, and cash-heavy lifestyles. At first, investigators dismissed it as prison gossip. But by 2013, federal prosecutors began noticing a pattern in contraband seizure reports. Items confiscated from inmates were reappearing in circulation within weeks. Phones, tobacco, pills, all supposedly destroyed, somehow found their way back behind the walls. A 2014 internal memo from the Office of the Inspector General, OIG, stated bluntly, "Contraband flow within Leavenworth suggests possible staff involvement. Disciplinary actions have been inconsistent. Further inquiry required." Behind those bureaucratic words hid a darker truth. The guards weren't just failing to stop the trade, some were running it. The bribery network. According to U.S.V. Bradshaw, 2017, a federal case unsealed in Kansas City, several correctional officers at Leavenworth were charged with accepting bribes to smuggle contraband into the facility. Court documents revealed a web of coded communication between inmates and officers, routed through girlfriends, relatives, and cash app deposit. One text message presented in evidence read, "2 packs for $800. Use the same drop. He'll take care of you." Packs meant bundles of synthetic marijuana, K2, which sold inside for 10 times the street price. A single smuggling run could earn a guard $5,000 to $10,000 in cash. The money, combined with fear, created a silent hierarchy among staff. Officers who refused to play along found themselves ostracized or transferred. One whistleblower later testified to the Senate Judiciary Committee, "You either became part of the business or you became the target. The walls didn't protect us, they trapped us." The secret recordings. But corruption wasn't the only hidden crime. In 2016, attorneys representing inmates at Leavenworth made a stunning discovery. Their confidential meetings were being secretly recorded. The recordings, first revealed in United States v. Carter, 2016, showed that hundreds of hours of private conversations between lawyers and inmates had been captured without consent. Defense attorneys were furious. Journalists called it the biggest breach of attorney-client privilege in U.S. prison history. When questioned, prison administrators claimed ignorance, suggesting it was part of routine security measures. But federal investigators soon found internal emails showing otherwise. According to an OIG report later released in 2018, Leavenworth staff had coordinated with a private contractor to install hidden microphones in visiting rooms. These recordings were then shared with prosecutors in ongoing cases, effectively giving the government access to defense strategies. The revelation shook the entire federal justice system. Fallout and cover-up. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Kansas immediately halted multiple prosecutions linked to the scandal. Judges ordered emergency reviews of dozens of convictions, fearing that evidence may have been tainted. One federal judge, Honorable Julie Robinson, later stated in open court, "This conduct strikes at the very heart of the Sixth Amendment. It is a breach so profound it challenges the integrity of the system itself." Behind closed doors, the Bureau of Prisons scrambled to contain the fallout. Emails obtained by the Kansas City Star under the Freedom of Information Act revealed directives to limit internal discussion and avoid direct acknowledgement of surveillance devices. Several senior officials quietly retired or were reassigned. No one was criminally convicted. But for those who had served inside, the damage was irreversible. A defense lawyer involved in the case said, "We used to fear the gangs. Now we fear the system that was supposed to protect us." The inmate reaction. Word spread quickly through the prison tiers. Inmates learned that even their lawyers, their supposed lifeline, had been compromised. Trust, already rare, vanished completely. Meetings became confrontations. Legal mail was torn apart before being read. One prisoner, quoted anonymously in Prison Legal News, 2018, said, "If they listen to my lawyer, what's next? My mother's call? My prayers." The revelation reignited violence across the yard. Guards described the tension as a pressure cooker about to burst. Minor altercations turned into riot. A kitchen brawl in 2017 left one inmate dead, 2 officers injured, and the facility on full lockdown for a week. The FBI later admitted that the surveillance breach had indirectly endangered staff safety by eroding the last traces of inmate trust. The media storm. National outlets descended on Kansas. The Washington Post, Reuters, and Vice News all ran exposes linking Leavenworth to a systemic failure of oversight. The Bureau of Prisons tried to frame it as an isolated incident, but leaked memos revealed similar surveillance practices at Metropolitan Detention Center, MDC, Brooklyn and Federal Correctional Institution, FCI, El Reno. Leavenworth, once again, was the face of scandal. Public confidence in federal prisons, already shaken by reports of abuse and overcrowding, crumbled further. When the House Committee on Oversight held hearings in 2019, one congressman summed it up with chilling clarity. "If the government spies on its prisoners and their lawyers, who's watching the government?" The aftermath. Broken trust following the investigation, Leavenworth underwent a superficial transformation. New cameras were installed, staff retrained, and warden positions rotated. But as multiple DOJ follow-up audits concluded in 2020 and 2021, the reforms barely scratched the surface. The real issue wasn't technology, it was culture. The same system that punished inmates for breaking rules rewarded staff for bending them. Every year, oversight committees issued the same recommendations: more accountability, better training, stronger ethics. And every year, the violence and corruption found new ways to adapt. A former inmate who later became a legal advocate told The Intercept, "Leavenworth didn't need microphones to hear the truth. The truth screamed every night from behind those walls." A war without guns. By the end of the 2010s, Leavenworth resembled less a prison and more a divided nation. One half ruled by bureaucrats who had lost control, the other by inmates who no longer believed in control at all. Guards came to work with body armor. Inmates walked with hidden blades. Every interaction, a search, a meal, a conversation, was a test of survival. Psychologists brought in by the Bureau described a culture of mutual fear. neither side trusted the other. Both sides expected betrayal. And in that stalemate, corruption thrived. Leavenworth's corruption files revealed more than misconduct. They exposed the soul of a system that had forgotten what justice meant. Inside those limestone walls, justice wasn't blind. It was bound, gagged, and recorded, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. The legacy of fear. Leavenworth doesn't rehabilitate men, it recycles trauma. Former inmate interview with the Marshall Project, 2021. For over a century, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary has stood as both a monument and a warning. Its walls, once built to symbolize order, have absorbed the screams of generations, a living archive of the American justice system's darkest lessons. When people outside hear Leavenworth, they imagine a prison. But those who've been inside know better. It's a culture, a memory, and for many, a haunting. The psychological wounds. After decades of riots, corruption, and brutality, the human cost of Leavenworth's history is incalculable. When researchers from Kansas University's Department of Psychiatry conducted interviews in 2019, they described widespread post-traumatic stress disorder not only among inmates, but among correctional officers and even maintenance staff. Guards who'd spent decades in the fort, as they called it, carried invisible scars. Many turned to alcohol. Others developed paranoia so severe they refused to sit with their backs to doors. One former officer told USA Today, "You go in to keep order. You come out never trusting anyone again." For inmates, the trauma was worse, layered and generational. Young men who entered on nonviolent drug charges were transformed into soldiers in an endless, invisible war. They learned to read faces for danger, sleep lightly, and never, ever show weakness. Even after release, the conditioning stayed. A 2020 reentry study found that over 70% of former Leavenworth inmates struggled to reintegrate, describing flashbacks, hypervigilance, and deep mistrust of authority. One man, identified only as R.M., told researchers, "Leavenworth doesn't leave you. It follows you, like it's inside your head." The ghost of reform. Over the years, politicians promised change. After every riot, every scandal, there were task forces, congressional visits, and new wardens. But real reform is slow, and Leavenworth's problems were older than any single administration. The Bureau of Prisons, BOP, repeatedly introduced modernization programs, improved staff training, mental health counseling, new surveillance technologies. Yet each initiative collided with the same reality. The culture inside the walls resisted change. In 2022, an internal audit by the Office of the Inspector General found that while use of force incidents had decreased, the rate of inmate-on-inmate assaults remained among the highest in the federal system. The problem wasn't just violence, it was trust. Decades of secrecy had built a mindset that every outsider, journalist, lawyer, reformer, was a threat. A current correctional counselor, speaking anonymously to The Guardian, admitted, "We're told to fix a system that doesn't want to be fixed. Everyone's just trying to survive another shift." The wall between two worlds. To understand Leavenworth's legacy, you have to see the divide it created, not just between guards and inmates, but between America's ideal of justice and its practice of punishment. Outside, the nation speaks of rehabilitation. Inside, survival comes first. Inmates often describe the experience as living in a world where time has frozen, an echo of the early 1900s, when punishment was physical and silence was law. Even with smartphones, new uniforms, and advanced cameras, the psychology remains medieval: obedience through fear. In 2023, a leaked BOP staff report revealed that many newer officers, some as young as 23, were quitting within months. The reasons? Unrelenting stress, moral injury, and lack of support. Several reported witnessing violence or corruption and being told to mind their business. The same patterns that defined Leavenworth in 1923 still defined it in 2023, only now the brutality was bureaucratic instead of bloody. The system beyond the walls. Leavenworth's story isn't isolated. Its influence radiates through the entire federal prison network. Policies born from its crises, the riot protocols of the 1990s, the gang monitoring systems of the 2000s, the digital surveillance reforms of the 2010s, shaped how every high-security facility in America operates today. But those reforms came at a cost. To make prisons safer, the system became colder. More cameras, fewer human interactions, longer isolation times. Experts at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice have warned that such environments, while reducing visible violence, also create psychological pressure cookers. Inmates isolated too long begin hallucinating. Guards become desensitized. Empathy dies quietly, replaced by procedure. The irony is painful. Every attempt to fix Leavenworth has made it more efficient and less humane. Memory and myth. Leavenworth's name has entered American folklore. It's mentioned in movies, rap lyrics, and late-night news segments as shorthand for the toughest prison in the nation. But that myth hides the truth, that Leavenworth isn't the toughest because of its walls, but because of the damage it leaves behind. Many of its most notorious inmates, mobsters, spies, cartel bosses, served their time and vanished. But their stories, like the prison itself, became part of a cultural obsession, punishment as spectacle. Visitors who drive past the facility today often stop to take photos from the road. Few realize they're looking at a place that's seen more blood, betrayal, and human suffering than any battlefield. Inside, those same stone walls stand unchanged, even as new policies come and go. It's as if the building itself refuses to forget. A century later, in 2024, Leavenworth quietly marked its 121st year in operation. There were no celebrations, only silence. The Bureau of Prisons issued a short press release praising its legacy of service and commitment to security. Not a word about the lawsuits, the suicides, or the recordings. But for those who lived it, the memories remain raw. One former warden, now retired, spoke to Reuters off-record. "Leavenworth taught me something I'll never forget. You can build the strongest prison in the world, but if you don't build trust inside it, the walls will eventually turn on you." What remains the story of Leavenworth is the story of control without conscience. A warning of what happens when a system values order more than humanity. From its founding ideals of moral reform to the surveillance scandals of the modern era, every chapter of Leavenworth's history carries the same theme: power corrupts and fear sustains it. The echoes of that lesson reach far beyond Kansas. They whisper through every courtroom, every solitary cell, every new prison being built under the promise of progress. Because Leavenworth was never just a prison. It was, and still is, a mirror reflecting what America chooses not to see.